On Sunday mornings in the year of our Lord 2026, my goal is to orient us as a congregation toward a year-long theme of evangelism. Part of that has to do with our services here. If I do this right, if the Lord convicts our hearts, one of the effects that we'll see is when every member sees every Sunday as Bring a Friend Sunday. We'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. But beyond what our church services look like, beyond inviting people to church, we will need to do some work on this word, evangelism. If you were raised like me, these are the images that might come to your mind when you hear that word. Somebody in a dark suit standing at a stranger's door, handing out a leaflet, or signing up to go on a 2-week mission trip halfway across the world. There are people in this church who have knocked on doors and people have come to Christ because of it. There are people in this church who have handed out leaflets and has brought people to Christ because of it. There are people in this church who take mission trips halfway across the world and share Christ, and people's lives are changed because of it. And we should praise God for all of that. But those are methods of how to go. What I want to do a little bit more this morning is to talk about what it is we do and say as we go. Because as you know, there are also people for whom the word evangelism is a dirty word. It conjures up bad feelings. If you were to ask some outsiders who have been approached like that, who did not respond well, tell me what happened. What is your experience? You might hear something like this. The strangers who came to my door, or the booklet they gave me to read, seemed primarily to tell me that they thought there was something wrong with my behavior or wrong with my church. Sometimes our go-to, cold call, stranger-to-stranger evangelism methods scream to an outsider, we have the answers, you should be asking the questions. We do the talking, you're supposed to listen. We want to tell you what's wrong with you and what's right with us, and you are supposed to like it. We can wordsmith you into the right actions, the right group, and the right eternity. And when that's our view of evangelism, many of us start to get very nervous. Like Moses, we might say, ooh, well, if that's the case, I need to have the right words, and I don't have the right words. Like Job, we might say to ourselves, well, it'd be nice to be the answer man with all the answers to the world's questions, but even I don't know what's going on half the time. I'm trying to figure this out myself. And so we shy away from sharing. And here's the dilemma. Evangelism is needed. Many are turned off by some tactics. And for that reason, we shy away from sharing. I'd like to take a little internal poll. So internal that there will be no show of hands. This is an internal poll. Here it is. Internal heart poll. First of 2 questions. How many non-believers have you shared the story of Christ, the gospel of Christ, His saving love, His transforming difference in your life with in all of 2025? I'm not talking about how many people over at Highway did you tell about how great Jimmy Shaw's Sunday morning Bible class is. I'm asking, how many people who do not know Jesus did you introduce to Jesus in some way in 2025? According to the last census, in White County, one of the questions was, what is your church home? Now remember, on a census, you can think back to the one time in your entire life you darkened the door of a church building, and that's when you were christened as a baby. And you can write that name down, even with that as a background. 42%. of people in our county said none. Think about that for a second. I want to ask again the first of two internal poll questions. How many non-believers, those with no faith, those with no church family, I'm not talking about sheep down the road. How many non-believers did you and I share the story of Christ, his saving love, the gospel with, in a deliberate way in all of 2025? Researchers are telling us that something unusual is happening. There seems to be a microburst of spiritual interest all around us. Now, some say that it's a fact that the Gen Z generation is the most spiritually open generation in our lifetime. I'm a little skeptical about that. I think it's too early to tell, and the numbers are mixed, but I do believe this. I believe across generational divides, there is something happening that in this moment more seem to be open than they were yesterday. A bit like the days after 9/11. And I don't know when that portal is going to close. But I know my friend Jonathan down in Little Rock said that more than a dozen people who have walked in the front door of the church where he preaches alone were atheists for 10 to 15 years, but felt compelled to come to church in the last 6 months. They want what we have, and we have what they need. Barna, the research company, asked tens of thousands of atheists what they look for most in life. 30% said peace. 24% said hope. 23% said truth. 24% added growth, and 23% added the word healing. The very things on the menu when people come to faith in Jesus is on the menu of people's hearts. And yet for all of this, so much of the time, we don't say a thing. Lifeway did their own research. And they found that in 2024, among churchgoers who were asked the question, 33% said that they shared their faith with at least a single person who didn't know Christ. Only 10% said they were eager to do so, and 58% admitted they were indifferent to the very idea. While you're thinking about that, let me give you a second internal poll question. How many non-believers do we know? I want to give everybody in this room a break for just a second. I'm not primarily interested in the first question this morning. I will be in the next few weeks. If your number was low on the first question, you can take a breather. I want to redefine what we mean by evangelism as something other than, more than, different than, door knocking that leads people through a Bible study that leads them to baptism. That is fine and good, and maybe a subset of evangelism. But that's not the definition I want to give this morning. So if you haven't done that, I'm not trying to give you a guilt trip, at least not this morning. Why do I say that? For two very important reasons. First, in the strictest sense, not everyone who is a follower of Christ is called to be, capital E, evangelist. Now, you might be surprised to hear me say that. I can't help it. It's in the Bible. My friend Jim McGuigan screams this, and I can still hear his Irish voice screaming this out. And he would say, has nobody read Ephesians 4 and verse 11? The Bible says God gave some to be evangelists. God called apostles. God called evangelists. God called pastors and teachers to equip the church. It is a particular role for some Christians, capital E, as a job. I believe that's true. I think it's wrong to tell the single mom raising 4 kids that if you didn't sign up for the trip to India, you have failed your discipleship. Don't believe that. So it is important to recognize that capital E, evangelist, is a function in the church. The second reason why I want to say this is because speaking the words of the gospel is one way to share the story of Jesus and not the only way. There are some people, think of the man in this church, who would never give a 35-minute sermon to an audience of 500 to 600 church members, but who can carve wood like nobody's business. And if you tell him, too bad, God expects you to be an evangelist, too bad you spent your life learning how to work with your hands, then we don't understand the assignment. So let me say again, if you answer the question, how many non-believers were accosted with the gospel when you launched into a sermon about Jesus this year in their living room, if that number's low, I'm not concerned with that right now. But breaks over. Because I'm really interested in the second question. How many non-believers do we really know? When you open the Gospels, and I mean any of them, you find this remarkable line over and over again. While the Pharisees rejected Jesus, prostitutes and tax collectors were flocking to his table. He feasted so much with the wrong sort of people that they called him a wino and a glutton, and here was the name that they came up with to put on the back of his jersey: friend of sinners. Now, we'll have plenty of time to talk about what it means to be a friend of sinners. But for now, I just want to ask you again a simple question in different words. This is what I see when I read the Jesus story. This is the challenging question I ask myself. How many prostitutes do I even know? How many parties with the wrong sort of people have I ever frequented in my life? If people could describe me in terms of who I hang out with, would they say that person seems to think the healthy don't need a physician, the sick do? Or would a better, more apt description of who I spend my days with be, he sure loves the comfort of his very healthy circle? How many non-believers do we even know? I'll tell you that the Great Commission at the end of Matthew may apply to all people. There's a debate. There is a calling of the apostles to do particular things. There may be an extrapolation to those called to be evangelists. But suppose that the person in our own fellowship who came up with the phrase, "go ye" means go me, was right. Then may I suggest that we read carefully the way the Greek reads in Matthew 28. Most of our Bibles say, "go and teach all nations," which makes you think the assignment is to get on a plane. What he actually says, the meaning of the text is, as you go. As you go. As you go about in your daily life, as the word spreads, as people move and migrate, as you are involved in visitation, as you go on vacation, as you live your life, as you have children and grandchildren, as your life turns, let this story be the one that is shared over and over again. The word evangelism is an English made-up word. It comes from the word evangel, which is gospel. And so if we reimagined evangelize, not as the images that come to our mind, but we reimagine the word as gospeling. And we apply it not just to the person who preaches sermons on Sunday or to the people who knock on doors or the people who go on mission trips. We apply it to every Christian in every walk of life and say, what does it mean to be gospeling? then we might think about more than the extrovert who glad hands strangers. We may think of Francis of Assisi, who said, "Go everywhere preaching the gospel, and if you absolutely must," how does it end? Use words. This morning, let evangelism or gospeling be reimagined as inviting people into the story of Jesus as we live it out with them, among them, and for them. As one of our shepherds, Mitch Walton, said this morning, the relationships we form to share the story of Jesus is where it's at. Inviting people into the story that we're living out among them, with them, and for them often is less a cold call door knock on an unsuspecting stranger and far more often a description of my friend group. My small group here at church, my agape group, could easily be described as a weekly get-together where Katie and I invite into our home for transparent conversations people that we live with, among them, with them, for them. It does not describe my casual conversations with a stranger on the street. And when I invite people into my agape group at my home, I'm not actually inviting them to see how well I follow the rules, or how well my behavior is, or how to develop a list of church distinctives. I'm actually inviting them in to see my flaws. I'm giving them an opportunity to really get to know me, warts and all. And if we do our agape group right, they should be able to call me out when I let my list of rules and right behavior and proper distinctives mask who I really am. I know that. I know that I become vulnerable enough for them to see my flaws. So why do I do it at all? Because I assume we're all flawed. We all misstep. We all have brokenness somewhere in our lives. And in sharing the realities of our stories, we begin to see, in spite of our flaws, that we really want, or at least we want Jesus to step in and fix it all. Now, do you remember on one occasion, some Greeks, some outsiders, maybe out of sheer curiosity, went up to the feast to Jerusalem to worship the God of Abraham at the festival? This is in John 12. They found a disciple named Philip, and they said one of the most beautiful lines in all of Scripture. Greeks, outsiders, who went to a Jewish worship festival, and they said to Philip, "Sir, we would like to see Jesus." There's the key. What I really want in my close association is for people to see Jesus either through me or in spite of me. Not instead of my words, but in watching me actually try to deal with them. What if evangelism didn't conjure up in your mind images of people in suits at doorsteps emphasizing rules and behavior and distinctives, but instead reminded you of people who truly in their own lives lived out in public lives of gospeling that shouted, "Sirs, we want nothing more than to know Jesus. We want to show Jesus. And if you want to see Jesus, come and see." What people need to see are humble Jesus people living lives as disciples, full of joy from having encountered Christ, full of conviction by the indwelling Spirit, living their lives in conversation with broken people. It's what I see in the Gospels, and it's what we're going to call the Jesus method. Think about this. How often does Jesus introduce outsiders to the gospel by explaining rules or listing wrong behaviors? You may think of some times when he does it, but almost always, those are passages in which Jesus is talking to insiders. Bible class teachers at the synagogue, not the prostitute, not the tax collector, not the Gentile. Instead, this morning I want to explore very quickly 4 aspects of Jesus' daily lived out discipleship towards following God that connected people with the life-changing gospel. And we can find the summary in Matthew 4, verses 23 through 25. He went through all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria. And they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from Galilee and the Decapolis and from Jerusalem and Judea and from beyond the Jordan. This is the word of the Lord. I want to point out to you 4 aspects of Jesus' method when it comes to gospeling. And the first word I want you to notice is the word healing. Listen again to this remarkable line. Healing every disease and every affliction among the people, so that his fame spread throughout all of Syria, and they brought him all the sick and all in trouble, and he healed them, leading to great crowds from both Jewish and Greek lands. Jesus' healing ministry was significant. So significant, all 4 Gospels talk about it. His healing ministry is often the first thing people saw when they met Jesus. You may remember that beggar at the entrance in John 9. What was his testimony when he was asked about Jesus? I don't know a thing about this man. I don't know whether he's a sinner or not, but I know one thing. I was blind, and now I see. It's tempting to think that Jesus' healing was a warm-up act for the real evangelism. That's not true. Do you realize that Jesus is saying sharing the gospel means telling people that I care about you in your real life. I care about all of you. What's hurting right now? Do you remember when he fed the 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish? Do you remember why? The text says he had compassion on them. Listen to how Matthew 9 spells this out in a very similar summary passage. Matthew 9, beginning in verse 35. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. When churches set up homeless ministries, when they do backpack for kids at the start of the school year, when they open up their doors to create soup kitchens for the neighborhood, when healthcare professionals in a congregation offer their services free of charge to hurting people in their area. These are not warm-up acts for gospeling. This is gospeling. So much so that the fame spreads, and pretty soon outsiders are bringing their troubles to you. And if in your daily life, as you go, when you offer a cup of cold water in the name of Christ to someone who's thirsty, when you visit a sick person because they're hurting, when you sit in a prison cell with someone because they're lonely, these are not warm-up acts for the gospel. This is gospeling. You want a gospel line for someone in your circle of influence? Here it is. Is there anything I can do for you? Second, notice that Jesus was teaching in their synagogues. Teaching in their synagogues. The location is important. The Greeks were met on the street. The Jewish people who went to synagogue to learn who God is and what He's called them to be is where Jesus met them. We might think that Jesus' main teaching ministry was explicating the Old Testament like a Sunday morning Bible class. He did some of that. Take a look at Luke 4. But I see his teaching, especially to outsiders, as offering hope. What did Jesus teach the woman at the well? Oh, you might think of particular lines, how to explain certain passages, but you know her response tells us that what she gleaned was, there is hope. even for me. What did the woman caught in the act of adultery learn from Jesus' teaching her? Answer, there is a future that doesn't have to look like my past. It's good if you can teach biblical exegesis, but if you can just teach people that God sees them better than they see themselves, that life is more than a 9 to 5, offering hope is gospeling. Third, Jesus went about proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, the good news of the kingdom. When Jesus proclaims kingdom parables, he tells stories that challenge his listeners to imagine a whole new world. They break open our assumptions and our preconceptions. You mean to tell me that unlike Alexander the Great or Caesar in Rome, the coming king from heaven invites outsiders to become insiders and to be equals? Are you telling me that if I truly understood what Jesus is offering, I would sell everything I have in order to keep it? Because it's worth more than everything else I've ever tried to achieve in my life? Are you telling me the King of the universe would be willing to forgive me of a debt I could never pay back in 1,000 lifetimes? And what he asks in return is that I have the heart to forgive my brother of the dime he owes me? You're rocking my world. Well, exactly. If we're going to proclaim the kingdom, we're going to have to start by living transformed kingdom lives. And this is where we have to ask ourselves a hard, challenging question. When choosing to buy a house, what neighborhoods most need to experience the good news of the kingdom? Why are the ones that come first to our minds the last ones we ask our realtor to show us? When picking our family vacation for this year, what opportunities would most help develop a kingdom mindset in my children? Then ask, what experiences would likely add to the overindulgent cultural worldview that I want to shield my kids from? And then ask, why is the second almost always where we choose to go? When it's time to budget for the month, think about the good that needs to be done in our own neighborhood. Think about what my neighbor doesn't have that I do. And then think about why we end up budgeting more for ourselves. If the people who know us best can see that money is our God, they will not be impressed by the kingdom we're offering. If the people who know us best can see that we're just as full of the anxious cares of the world, so much so that they choke out our joy. If we look just like everyone else who seems to be searching for meaning and peace in this world, outsiders who get to know us will never believe that we have found the Prince of Peace at all. But if they see something in our living room that they've never experienced anywhere else in their day, wouldn't that be something? A generosity that asks nothing in return, a forgiving nature that knows no end, a constant joy that can't be snuffed out, a sense that nothing in the world matters to these people like the love of Jesus filling their souls. That's what made people come to Christ in the first century, and it works now. And finally, would you notice that as a result of offering hope, proclaiming the good news of a different sort of kingdom, and meeting felt needs, people wanted to walk with, walk along, walk behind Jesus. They wanted to experience life with him. Maybe the best phrase to explain this in the New Testament is the phrase, eating with. They didn't just say he was a friend of sinners. They said he eats with sinners, because who you break bread with announces who your in-group is willing to include. Can I share with you a fascinating statistic? Tom Rayner is a church growth consultant. He gave a very interesting statistic. I'm going to use it again next week in a different way, but listen to it now. If you were to invite 100 people to church, on average, 15 will say yes. 15% of those invited to church come. But if you invite them to come to church with you and then to go get a bite to eat after with you, the number goes from 15% to 80%. Why do you think that is? People might have some interest in looking at something alongside you, but they're very interested in sharing intimate life experiences with you. What would it look like if individually, as a church, in our small groups, in our Bible classes, in our life together, we thought less of member versus visitor and more of a journey in which we are sharing, gospeling, living with and among people at all different stages of the journey? What would it look like if people who come to Christ to be baptized and receive His Spirit are people already walking among us, sharing life in our lunch tables, playing games with our kids as part of the communities that we're forming, because gospeling is at the heart of what we do. Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been enriched. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, reach out to us at prayers@wschurch.net. God bless you. Tune in next week.